Why would we need Arei Miklat when Moshiach comes? After the instruction in our parasha, which is when the Eibishter will destroy the nations living in Israel, and you will then inherit their land. So the Torah tells us, then we have to designate 3 cities of refuge, and their purpose is that any person who murders, especially a person who murders inadvertently, they go there in order to be protected from the vigilante members of the family. Then the Torah continues as follows. In the future, when the Eibishter expands your borders, as he promised to your forefathers that he will do, and the Eibishter will give you the entire land that he had promised to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, then you're supposed to add another 3 cities of refuge. So the Yerushalmi, the Sifri, Rashi quotes it all, tell us, this instruction of the 3 additional Arei Miklat is going to be in the time of Moshiach, at which time the Jewish people will also inherit the land of Eretz Keni, Knizi, Vikat, Moini, the 3 lands that were promised to Avraham Avinu, but we never were given access to. The Rambam says the same thing. He tells us, in the time of Moshiach, we're going to add 3 additional Arei Miklat to the existing 6 that were in the time of biblical times. Where will they be? Again, in the lands that were not yet given to the Jewish people, but were promised that the Eibishter made a covenant with Avraham Avinu that we'd get that land. So the obvious question is, the question is, why will there be a need in the future to add cities of refuge? They're not going to be murderers. Even in the nations of the world, there won't be murderers. Like Yeshayahu Hanavi promises us, no nation will lift a sword against another nation. So if there's no murderers, why do you need Arei Miklat? You'll answer, the primary purpose of Arei Miklat is for people who kill by accident. Even that surely can't happen in the time of Moshiach, because the whole concept of killing somebody inadvertently surely cannot happen in the time of Moshiach for 2 reasons. From the perspective of the victim, as well as from the perspective of the perpetrator. Why from the perspective of the victim? Because if a person is killed by somebody who kills them inadvertently, we know that is an indication that they unfortunately deserved to die. As the Gemara comments on the pasuk, where a person had not planned to harm somebody else, but the Eibishter created a situation whereby this person killed. Says the Gemara, what's the scenario? It's a scenario of 2 people who had killed. One of them had killed by mistake. One of them had killed intentionally. But in either case, are there witnesses to be able to send the one to Golus and to be able to prosecute the other? So what does the Eibishter do? The Eibishter brings them both together into one meeting place. The person who is a real murderer lands up sitting underneath a ladder, and the person who had inadvertently killed somebody else lands up climbing down the ladder, and he falls on the murderer beneath him, and kills him. So the person who was a murderer and therefore deserved the death penalty is now dead. And the person who accidentally killed him, well, now there are people around because it's a pundak, it's a meeting place, and so therefore people see what's happening, and he has to go into Golus, which is what he deserved already from beforehand. So if in the future there's no such concept as a murderer, then there's nobody who deserves to be killed to create the scenario of somebody who kills them by accident. So therefore, from the perspective of the victim, there's no way that the scenario could play out. Likewise, from the perspective of the perpetrator, it should not play out. Because how does a person do a mistaken avera? They must have some connection or relationship, even in the smallest fashion. Like the Gemara has just told us, well, the person deserved to be in a situation that they fall off the ladder and crush the person beneath them. So therefore they must have some connection. They must have some kind of a relationship with an Aveira, which is why the Eibishter allowed them to be in this terrible position of killing somebody inadvertently, which is why they have to go into Golus, because part of the purpose of Golus is to atone for them. How's that going to happen when Moshiach comes? One of the big things is that the Eibishter is going to remove negativity from the world. So there's no capacity for a person to do an Aveira even accidentally. So how could there ever be a case of somebody killing somebody else and having to go to the Arei Miklat? Why do we need to build Arei Miklat for the time of Moshiach? So some people will tell you because. The answer is because. Yes, mefarshim. So the Zayis Ranon says, what's the reason? Because it's a mitzvah that the Eibishter decided that we have to fulfill, whether it makes sense or serves a purpose or not. Or to quote the Minchas Chinuch, it's a decree that the Eibishter made. Because logically there's no reason for Arei Miklat in the future. Because as the Minchas Chinuch says, in the time of the King Moshiach that we are looking so forward to, there's obviously going to be just goodness and peace, etc. Except that the Eibishter decided that we should have to fulfill this mitzvah, and it was the Eibishter's decision that in total there have to be 9 Arei Miklat, even if they don't serve a purpose. Maybe that's the answer. So stop trying to understand it. It's what the Eibishter decided. But it's not a good enough explanation, because let's read what the parasha says when it describes those Arei Miklat we're going to have to prepare in the future. After the Torah tells us that the Eibishter will expand our borders and then we'll have to add 3 additional Arei Miklat. The Torah tells us why we'll need these Arei Miklat. Because we don't want innocent blood to be spilled, which effectively is the family members are going to go after the perpetrator, and therefore he has to escape to the Arei Miklat. That means that implies from the pasuk that in the time of Moshiach there will be Arei Miklat, and the purpose of those Arei Miklat is to preserve or protect the individual who has killed somebody. So why would we have the fear of people killing in the time of Moshiach? So there's another explanation. Who says they killed in the time of Moshiach? Yesh meforshim, some explain the whole concept of having Arei Miklat is something that will only apply in the first stage of the Messianic age. Because at that stage we're told there's no fundamental difference between our reality and the reality of Moshiach at the initial stage, except that we will not be persecuted by the nations of the world. Which is not so in the subsequent phase of Moshiach, at the time that the Jewish people expand their understanding and maturity of appreciation of the Eibishter, then also will no longer need Arei Miklat. Okay, in that case you could explain we could say that this piece in the Torah, which is telling us that in the time of Moshiach we have to add an additional 3 Arei Miklat, actually supports an opinion that the Rambam teaches us, which is this shita we've just discussed, that there's no real distinction between the initial stage of Moshiach and the world as we know it. That at least in the very first phase of the Moshiach experience, there's no real difference between our world, and therefore there will still be problems, even though it is the Messianic age. And the Rambam says this in detail, where he writes in the Mishnah Torah, don't let it enter your mind that any of the ordinary processes of the world are going to cease when Moshiach comes. Don't believe that. Or that the Eibishter is going to introduce new natural laws that haven't been part of the nature until now. But rather the world as we know it continues as we know it. And therefore there is the potential of somebody who kills somebody, at least inadvertently, because that is part of the natural way that the world runs. Now, if we're going from that perspective, we can actually understand why the Rambam worded his halachas in a particular way, or at least so we'd believe. We can now pay attention to something in the specific nuance of how the Rambam describes the importance of our belief in Moshiach. First, the Rambam teaches us that anybody who does not believe in Moshiach or wait with anticipation for Moshiach to come immediately. Not only do they reject all of the Nevi'im, but they specifically also reject the Torah and Moshe himself. And then he brings evidence that the Torah speaks about Moshiach, including the prophecies of Bilam. Here's the interesting part. Then the Rambam brings yet another Torah-based proof for the fact that they are going to that you have to believe in Moshiach. That the Torah says you have to believe in Moshiach. But where does it bring it? In an independent, separate halacha, which is Af be'orei miklat oimer. Also, with regards to Arei Miklat, it speaks about the time of Moshiach. When the Eibusha expands your borders, then you will add 3 additional cities of refuge. Says the Rambam, that never happened to date. We have not expanded Israel into the territories of Keni, Knizi, V'Kadmoni, V'Loitziva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Toyu. And the Eibusha would not give us an empty instruction, so that must happen at some point, which means we have to believe in Moshiach. So for the Chayrin and Movin, it is strange. The Rambam is building a case that if a person doesn't believe in Moshiach, they're rejecting the Torah, and he brings multiple proofs. One of those proofs is Arei Miklat. So why is it in a different halacha? Why is it not in the same paragraph of all of the ways to prove to us how important it is to believe that Moshiach is coming and that we have to wait for Moshiach? But based on what we've just said, where the Rambam says there's no real distinction between our world and the Messianic age in the initial stages, and therefore there's a need for a miklat, then it all makes sense. The Rambam wants to allude to the fact that he's telling us about the Arei Miklat is not only to further support his claim in the preceding halacha, which is that if you don't believe in Moshiach, it's a rejection of Torah. But the Rambam put this into its own paragraph because it relates also to what he's about to say next, which is where he says Moshiach don't believe that Moshiach has to do miracles and make new things happen in the world, or resurrect the dead, or anything outside of the ordinary. It's not true. And then he says, because look at Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was willing to accept the possibility of Bar Kochba being Moshiach, and he didn't do anything supernatural. Therefore, it is not a requirement of Moshiach to do something supernatural. The Arei Miklat links to that message, not only to the message of the fact that there is evidence in the Torah that you have to believe in Moshiach. How does the Rambam prove his point that no major radical change in the nature of the world will happen when Moshiach comes, at least not in the first phase? Because look, we have to have Arei Miklat. The fact that we have to increase the number of Arei Miklat illustrates that the world is an ordinary world where people still can kill each other, at least accidentally. And therefore, looking for supernatural things is a moot point. It's not something that we need in order to be able to validate Moshiach. So we'd think the Rambam is telling us. Except, it's actually not a good explanation of what the Rambam said for quite an obvious reason. In Kavanas Rambam Loimar, if the Rambam did want to tell us, if it's true that the Rambam telling us about the fact that there will be Arei Miklat in the Messianic age proves to us that Moshiach does not have to change the natural order, then he should have said it. He would have said so clearly. Because that would be proof from a pasuk in the Torah that the world does not change when Moshiach comes. Instead, he brings the example of Bar Kochba, which is just something recorded in the words of Chazal. That's not as powerful as a pasuk. So if the Rambam intended the pasuk of Arei Miklat to prove to us that the world is normal when Moshiach comes, say so. Besides that, Yisayim Mizah. Let's listen to the language that the Rambam used in the very next halacha. Does it sound like he's continuing from halacha Beis, which is about Arei Miklat, or does it sound like he's telling us something new? And don't let it enter your mind that Mashiach has to do miracles to change the nature of the world. Instead of just saying, he could have just simply said, and Moshiach doesn't. There's Arei Miklat, and Moshiach doesn't have to do miracles. Which would then have implied, after Halacha Beis, which tells us about Arei Miklat in the future. You might think, hang on a second, okay, so there'll be Arei Miklat, but then you might think the Moshiach has to do certain miracles in order to prove himself. You hear what the Rambam saying? He said, I told you about the Arei Miklat, and despite telling you about the Arei Miklat, you could still believe that Moshiach has to do supernatural things, and therefore I need the story of Rabbi Akiva, meaning that just knowing that there is an instruction to add 3 additional Arei Miklat when Moshiach comes, ein kol raya Mashiach lo yitzarech la'aros eisus meisim cholei. That doesn't prove to us that Moshiach is not doing supernatural things. Move on, which implies which means that the Rambam is not convinced that just because we have to have Arei Miklat in the time of Moshiach, that is an indication that the world remains the same in the time of Moshiach. It is possible that the world could have changed and become miraculous, and you would still need Arei Miklat, which takes us back to our original question: why? Why Arei Miklat in a supernaturally peaceful world? So the answer is, at least it would sound like the answer is, surface, because there's another layer that we're still going to have to add to this. Just the fact that there are Arei Miklat in the time of Moshiach doesn't mean that the time of Moshiach hasn't changed. Because maybe there's somebody who killed somebody inadvertently today, and of course today there's no Arei Miklat. But as soon as Moshiach comes and there are Arei Miklat, that person would have to go to the Arei Miklat for things that they perpetrated before Moshiach came. And if the person happens to be in that expanded territory of Eretz Yisrael when this happens, then they'll have to have an Arei Miklat nearby in order to get to. And this is not a surprise, because the same thing applies to bringing a korban chatas. Because the Gemara tells us Rabbi Shmuel made a record in his ledger to say, he did X and Y for which he was chayav to bring a korban chatas. So he made a record. When Moshiach comes, I'll bring the chatas then. What does that mean? Not that it does the Aveira when Moshiach comes. He has a debt owing that has to be fulfilled when Moshiach comes. Likewise, a person who inadvertently kills somebody else has a debt owing that they're supposed to go to the Arei Miklat. When Moshiach comes and the Arei Miklat are provided, that person's going to have to go. You'll say, but the whole reason for Arei Miklat, unlike the korban chatas, which is to atone for the person, surely the reason for Arei Miklat is no longer relevant in the time of Moshiach. What's the reason? Because we're worried that a family member is going to pursue the perpetrator. Because he's passionate, he's been angered by what happened. And he'll reach him because it takes long to get to the Arei Miklat, allows enough time for the family to catch up with the perpetrator. And maybe he'll kill him. So therefore the Torah mandated that in order for this perpetrator who had no malicious intent, it was an unfortunate accident, but we want to protect him from the family who's begging for blood. So therefore, if you expand the territory of Eretz Yisrael, you have to create more accessible Arei Miklat in that territory. You need Arei Miklat that are close enough that he could realistically escape from the family who's chasing him. But there you'll ask the same question. Surely that level of anger and that need for vengeance is not going to happen in the time of Moshiach. That's part and parcel of the world as we know it. So why are we worried that this guy has to run? You know why? Because in the Isa B'Sifri B'Parasha Seni, because the Sifri in our Parasha says, Mitzvah bihad goyel hadam le'erdoif, that even if the family members don't necessarily feel that level of anger and the need for vengeance, they actually have a responsibility to chase this individual, probably so he'll go into the Arei Miklat. Well, if it's a mitzvah to chase the Goyel Adam, then the mitzvah is eternal even in the time of Moshiach, which explains why the perpetrator has to run to the Arei Miklat. And therefore, even in the time of Moshiach, you need a place for this person to escape because the family is supposed to chase him. Now, but Mishnah Isa, shemitzvah b'yad goyel adam la'arges ha'retzach rak b'nidain shel retzach sheyatza chutz litchum Arei Miklat mitzvah goyel adam. You've probably heard this before, that the Mishnah says it a little differently to the Sifri, that it only becomes a mitzvah for the goyel adam to chase the perpetrator if the perpetrator leaves the safety of the Arei Miklat. But there's no mitzvah to chase him when he's initially running to the Yarei Miklat. So it sounds like maybe there's a difference of opinion between the Sifri and the Mishnah. But because we always try to avoid illustrating that there's conflict in Torah and rather show how all Torah opinions are really saying the same thing, therefore let's explain this. Let's not misunderstand that what's going on over here is if the person went to the Arei Miklat. Now, when he leaves the Arei Miklat, the mitzvah is for the family to chase him. And there is a ban against the family touching a hair on his head until he reaches the Arei Miklat, like there's a ban on any kind of murder. Rather, we have to acknowledge that both the opinion in the Mishnah and what's clearly said in the Sifri are that the family do have a responsibility immediately to avenge the blood of their family member by chasing the Goyal Adam. But because the Torah provided a safe haven for the perpetrator, so until he gets there, and certainly when he's in there, it's as if there's a lion in the path of the Goyal Adam, not allowing him access. In other words, the Sifri is saying there's a mitzvah on the family to kill the Goyal Adam unless he's in the Ir Miklat. And the Mishnah is saying, while that mitzvah is immediately incumbent, it's not practical unless he goes into the Ir Miklat and leaves. But until he gets to the Ir Miklat, there's a special protection. So, bottom line, what are we saying? It is possible that in the time of Moshiach we'll need Ir Miklat. Why? Because there's somebody who killed inadvertently before Moshiach came, because once Moshiach comes, there's nobody killing anybody. But the family has a mitzvah to chase him, therefore he needs an Ir Miklat in order to escape them. But there's still something we need to clarify over here. The Rambam holds that there is no mitzvah for the family to pursue the perpetrator, but they are given the right, should they choose, to pursue him if he leaves the Arei Miklat. In that case, why do we need Arei Miklat when Moshiach comes? Even if you go with the Rambam's view, which is that the world initially will be a normal world. Okay, fine. So in a normal world, a person could, God forbid, kill somebody else inadvertently. It's possible in a normal world. But in a normal Mashiach world, is it possible that somebody will be so worked up that they'll be impulsively chasing? The whole concept of the Goyal Adam. The Rambam says clearly that in the time of Moshiach, and the implication is right from the beginning, which means in the time where it's a so-called normal world, in that time of Ois Azman, there'll be no hunger, no war, there'll be no envy, there'll be no competition. And the entire world will be completely invested in just exploring and knowing Hashem better and better. So, in that reality, where the fundamental psychology of humans has changed, and we're no longer competing with each other, when everybody is completely invested in just serving the Eibishter. How is it possible then that somebody gets to kill somebody else and there is no way to bring them to court? We just got to leave it to the vigilantes. Which vigilantes? Where's the psychology of people in such a wonderful time with such a higher focus that they're going to start chasing each other? So then, don't suggest. Well, the purpose of the Arei Miklat is not for protection of the perpetrator, although that's usually what the Arei Miklat does. There's another reason for Arei Miklat, and maybe that will still apply in the time of Moshiach, as atonement for a sin. Because as we well know, the objective of Arei Miklat is not simply to protect a person, but also to atone. As the Torah tells us clearly, that we don't want We don't want blood to be spilled. Which means that in the time of Moshiach, there will be Arei Mikrat not only to atone, but also to protect, because the Torah, when it spoke about the additional Arei Mikrat, said, so blood doesn't get spilled. And besides, if we were to argue that the only reason you have Arei Mikrat in the future, in the time of Moshiach, is for atonement, then we don't need the Arei Mikrat to be accessible and close by. And then we don't need new Arei Mikrat in the new expanded territory, because you're not running for your life, you're going on a rehabilitation program. Okay, so pack your bags and go to wherever the Arei Mikrat are, and if it takes you a bit longer to get there, that's fine, because you just want to have the atonement. And there are already Arei Mikrat in other locations. But if the reason, and possibly the primary reason, for Arei Mikrat is to protect and save the perpetrator from the family who wants revenge, then we understand why you need new Arei Mikrat in new territory. Because if the guy has to run for his life, it shouldn't be too far. So back to square one, why would we need Arei Mikrat in the time of Moshiach to run away from people who are apparently chasing after us, or chasing after the perpetrator? Shloimar Abir Bozes, the explanation is this. All of the details of the Goyal Hadam, the family member who is meant to chase the perpetrator and potentially kill him, this is not a halacha to address human nature. Unfortunately, this is how people are, and they're very impulsive, and they get very worked up, and they may take the law into their own hands. Let's find a way to address it. Because we're worried that the Yetzer Hara in the time of Moshiach, as the Yetzer Hara might now, will entice the person to a radical response. And therefore the Torah said, okay, fine, you can go ahead. If you need to kill the murderer, you're entitled to, or according to the Sifri, you're required to. Let's assume that a person who kills somebody else accidentally is not required, does not deserve capital punishment, which is the distinction between an inadvertent murderer and a malicious murderer. So if the person does not deserve the death penalty, can you suggest then, but he shouldn't die, but the family's allowed to kill him? Or like the Sifri suggests, that it's actually a requirement. How could it be a requirement to kill a person who the Torah doesn't believe should be killed? It can only be that the pursuit of the perpetrator is something mandated and encouraged by the Torah. There are scenarios where the Torah empowers the Beis Din to kill a person, when it is amazed, meaning there are witnesses who pre-warned the individual. There are circumstances where the death is going to be the Eibish's choice, like the guy sitting under the ladder. And if, God forbid, somebody kills another person inadvertently, so the fact is he killed a person. And therefore, the Torah gave the rights to the person who is their halachic heir, who has a relationship with the victim. And therefore, the Torah wants the person to be upset. They shouldn't take it sitting down. It's an atrocity that happened. A life was taken. It should bother them. And therefore, they're given license as harigas haritzeach to be able to kill the perpetrator, to neutralize the impact of the avera that was done, the killing of a person. Like the pasuk says, that what's meant to happen is that the goyal adam, the family member, kills the murderer, and does not take any monetary bail application or bounty in order to be able to let him off the hook. As the Torah says, we should not chas v'shalom mislead or mistreat. Al-hachnif is to batter somebody up. This is the land that has absorbed blood of a murder victim, and you can't just pay it off. The only way to atone for the blood is with blood, as it says in our parasha, that we would then have the responsibility of the shedding of blood. Therefore, even from the perspective of the Rambam, who does not call it a mitzvah for the family to pursue the perpetrator, but just says that the family has the rights to do so, still you're still going to need those Arei Mikrat in the future. Should the family take up this particular chase, the guy has to run. Because the Goel Adam chasing the perpetrator is not whimsical. It's not because they're a worked up family. It's because the Torah gives license for it. Not just because that's the nature of people and that's how they behave and we need to accommodate them. And if it's something which is appropriate according to the Torah in the correct circumstances, then it will exist in the time of Moshiach. Even at the time of Shaloi Kinav Tachrus, when there's no envy and there's no competition, which means it's not a personal, subjective thing that the guy needs to take revenge. It's an objective requirement in Torah that murder should not go unpunished. Even at a time when the entire world is completely focused on nothing else but to know and appreciate the Eibishter properly. So maybe that the Eibishter allows us, if we fulfill the mitzvah of Arei Mikra today spiritually, which is limud Torah, by investing completely in Torah learning, Divrei Torah kultim, because Torah creates a safe haven for us, like the Arei Mikra did. Especially in this time of the year, which is the city of refuge of the entire year, the month of Elul. Which is alluded to in the Rosh Hashanah brought in the Shulchan Aruch, that the words about the inadvertent murder spell out Elul. Lirma is to illustrate to us that the Eibishter in His great kindness to us, Inov Zimin Chodesh Elul, He presented and prepared for us Chodesh Elul lechol mi shechata b'teich hashana, for any person who sinned during the course of the year, sheyoshavas b'tshuva b'kabluhu, that's the time they should return to Hashem, and Hashem will accept their return. Through our commitment to Torah, we should be zoicha to see the expansion of Eretz Yisrael's territories as promised, literally. And we should be zoicha to the additional 3 Arei Mikrat that will happen then. As well as the spiritual version of what that means, which is the revealing of the secrets behind the mitzvahs of the Torah, which we will only really appreciate when Moshiach comes, and that should happen b'meheira v'yomenu mamash, literally right now.